Hello and welcome to another Tattered Cover virtual event. My name is Adam. I work at Tattered Cover, and I'm just here to introduce today's amazing panel and moderator. You're in for a treat. This panel is called The Iron Horse. I feel like you all understand who that is, but before we get started, I just want to say there is closed captioning for those who need it. At the bottom of your screen on YouTube, there should be a black bar that's and a button that says CC. You can press that if you need closed captioning. For all things Tattered Cover, please check out tatteredcover.com. If you go to tatteredcover.com/events, you could find all of the events we're doing for the All-Star Game. We have at least 7 more events happening. And then if you're in Denver, we just opened up a new location at a building called McGregor Square. You can literally see Coors Field from the bookstore, and we have 1,000 baseball books we just got in just for baseball fans. So please check out the McGregor Square location of Tattered Cover, right across the street from Coors Field. And now I'm going to turn it over to Steve Wulf, who is moderating today's event, and he'll introduce our panelists. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we'll make sure that the panelists can see them. But Steve, please, welcome. Thank you for moderating, and take it away.
Adam, thank you very much. My name is Steve Wulf. I am what you might call a veteran sports writer. And I have more than a passing interest in Lou Gehrig because I pass by the garden apartment that he shared with Eleanor every day. Back when he lived here, Larchmont was very much a murderer's row kind of town. General Manager Ed Barrow lived here, and Waite Hoyt had his funeral home across from the train station. And the building is actually now the fanciest restaurant in town. Well, on the evening of June 2nd, 2021, 80 years after Lou died at the age of 37, the TV screen at the bar was turned to the Major League Baseball Network, which was showing tributes all across the country to Lou. Major League players were wearing patches. The fields were covered with 4 ALS as a tribute to both his number and the disease that took his life. He died at 10:10 p.m. on June 2nd, 1941, in his home in Riverdale, with his parents, his wife Eleanor, and her mother at his side. The family's first visitors were Yankee General Manager Ed Barrow and his wife, and longtime teammate Babe Ruth and his wife. Soon enough, the nation was mourning Lou. I'd like to read this description of his funeral service in Riverdale 2 days after his death, from Jonathan Eig's brilliant and deeply moving The Luckiest Man. The ceremony began promptly at 10 o'clock. About 100 people clustered inside the church. The service, which lasted about 7 minutes, was as simple and straightforward as the public image of the man being remembered. Eleanor sat silently. Christina, his mother, wept. The Reverend Gerald V. Berry read the Episcopal service for the dead. The Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away, he said. He paused and announced there would be no eulogy. We need none, he said, because you all knew him. With that, Gehrig's mahogany coffin, blanketed in red roses, was carried to the hearse. As the hearse pulled out of the church driveway and onto the Henry Hudson Parkway, hundreds of strangers stood in the pouring rain along the side of the road, saying goodbye. As it turns out, Reverend Berry was wrong. We did need eulogies. We've needed books, we've needed movies, we've needed number 4 jerseys, we've needed this Lou Gehrig McDonald's glass, all to pay tribute to this man. And the Reverend was wrong to think we all knew him. Our guests today have helped to reveal Lou Gehrig not just as a Yankee, but also as a son, a student, a husband, the owner of a German Shepherd in the 1933 Westminster Dog Show, a cowboy actor, a failed Tarzan, and as Gary Cooper. As for his famous farewell speech, well, he came this close to not delivering it. Let me introduce our guests, each of whom has taught us something new about Gehrig. Jonathan Eig, whom I've already mentioned, is the author of 5 books, 3 of them New York Times bestsellers, and 3 of them about 3 of the greatest names in sports history, Muhammad Ali, Jackie Robinson, and Lou Gehrig. He and Ken Burns are preparing a documentary on Ali that will air later this year. And he is writing a biography of the Reverend Martin Luther King. Jonathan, maybe you want to try to tackle something a little bigger next time. We also have Alan Gaff, a master historian whose 2020 book, Lou Gehrig, The Lost Memoir, unearths a series of columns entitled Following the Babe that appeared in newspapers across the country in 1927. It was ghost-ridden, of course, but it does bear the mark of verisimilitude and paints a portrait of the slugger as a young man. Our third guest is Richard Sandomir, an accomplished journalist whose day job is to bring people alive. He writes obituaries for the New York Times. In 2017, he also wrote a wonderful book about the making of the myth of the man, The Pride of the Yankees, Lou Gehrig, Gary Cooper, and the making of a classic. Gentlemen, my first question, and you can take it in whatever order you want. My first question is this: when Major League Baseball honored Gehrig on June 2nd, what were your own thoughts? Jonathan?
Jonathan, you're on mute, sorry.
Thanks, Steve, and thanks for that nice introduction. My first thought was that it was a really great tribute for a guy who never blew his own horn. Gehrig was so shy and didn't even like signing autographs, and really until he got married and his wife kind of pushed him to come out of his shell a little bit, didn't enjoy any of the trappings of his fame. And he's now such an important figure in history, not just in baseball history, but for anyone with ALS, really for anybody who's suffering from a fatal illness, from a hard time. Gehrig is this great symbol of strength, and for Major League Baseball to recognize that and to recognize how important his message is today, that, you know, we celebrate life, even if it's a short life. We you know, he's the luckiest man, called himself the luckiest man on the face of the earth, because he had so much during those short years that he lived, that he appreciated whatever time he had left. That message is really one that we need, and we need his kind of courage, that kind of quiet courage today more than ever in this age when everybody's just out blowing their own horn all the time. Gehrig is such a badly needed hero for our day.
I'll echo what Jonathan said, and say it was about time. This tribute could have been done years ago. Thankfully, it was done, but I kind of wish, with the story of his courage, that this had been done before.
Yeah, I agree with both Jonathan and Richard, but I took kind of a different tack. We have a minor league team here in Fort Wayne that's associated with the Padres. So what I did, I donated 10 of my books to be given away to the crowd on June 2nd. And then I also did about an hour-long interview with the spokesman for the Tin Caps, is what they're called. And I also made a donation to the ALS Foundation, and I bought a Lou Gehrig jersey, which I admit was half off because I bought it on June 2nd. But I agree. This was long overdue, and I think it's great that Major League Baseball has embraced the ALS Foundation.
Thank you. My second question for all of you, and we'll take it in the same order. I know you all learned a lot about Lou Gehrig in the course of your research. What were some of the highlights of I guess, the surprises that you discovered in writing about his life? Jonathan?
Well, you know, I grew up a huge Yankee fan, and Gehrig was always this sort of cardboard cutout figure to me. He was two-dimensional. You know, we knew his numbers, and we knew very little about him personally, and he wanted it that way. You know, he didn't give a lot of interviews. He never wrote a memoir. He never wrote his autobiography. Babe Ruth cranked one out every offseason, it seemed like, just, you know, for a little extra cash. So I felt like Gehrig was hiding, and everything about him was really much more interesting and difficult than I expected, because he was so shy, and there were so few people left who knew him. By the time I started working on this book around 2000, and I found maybe 30, 40 people who were still alive who knew him, but no family members. He didn't have any kids. He didn't have any nieces or nephews. So it was very hard to find anybody who knew him intimately, certainly at that point. And I was just shocked at how insecure he seemed at times, how shy he was, especially around women. How when he finally met Eleanor, she more or less had to drag him into this relationship and into marriage to break him away from his mother. His love for his mother is at once fascinating and touching, but also a little disturbing that he seems to have never had a chance to cut the cord. Here's a kid who has a chance to go to college anywhere with a baseball scholarship, and he chooses to go to the school where his mom works as a maid in a fraternity house kitchen, and then goes after class every day to help her clean the kitchen. This is clearly a guy who's got a lot of emotional baggage, and I loved exploring all that and getting to know him better, and then to see him finally evolve and come into his manhood and his adulthood was really inspiring.
Well, I had a number of surprises in researching the making of The Pride of the Yankees, which came out not long after Lou died. But in my early research about Lou, because you can't write a book about The Pride of the Yankees without doing some research about Lou, I found a 1927 article profile of him in the New Yorker, and it was called The Little Heine, because that was his nickname as a German kid growing up in New York City. And the writer of the article was so critical of Lou for being a quiet, dull guy. And this is the 1927 season this article is written, that at one point he said, Lou Gehrig does not even deserve to have fans. That's pretty harsh. It sounded like the writer was hoping he would have been able to interview Babe Ruth. Now, here's the irony of this, or the coincidence. The writer, Niven Bush, years later would be a story editor for Samuel Goldwyn, and he's the one who recommended that Goldwyn make a movie about Lou Gehrig.
It's great.
Well, the other gentlemen have mentioned how shy he was. I think that was best epitomized by one day after they were married, he and Eleanor were shopping at a department store, and soon word got around that Lou Gehrig was in the store. So everyone started to find Lou Gehrig, and every kid that was available was hounding him, wanting to talk to him, wanting autographs. And Lou's response was he went and hid in the restroom. That's how shy he was. A complete antithesis of modern superstars who do everything to bring attention to themselves, whether it's on social media or in person, or the woman they choose to date in public, or whatever. But yeah, he was a lonesome, I think, almost tortured at times. He would rather go on a long walk or ride roller coasters by himself than associate with other players on the team. He just liked to be alone.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, Alan, I think part of what is so extraordinary is that he finally emerges and allows himself to be seen in public when he becomes ill, and he goes completely frank with he gets completely honest with the public and makes this incredible speech saying that he may have a bad break, but he's had an awful lot to live for. And after all those years of hiding, when does he emerge? When he's at his lowest, when he's at his weakest. And that was in a day when people didn't talk about their illnesses in public. Think about FDR and what lengths he went to hide his disability, right? It was very unusual for athletes to talk about their travails and certainly their illness, certainly a fatal illness. So Gehrig really overcomes his shyness in the biggest way possible when it matters the most.
Just to interject one thing, I've always been fascinated by the sort of last chapter of his public life, working for the parole board. I mean, how did that come about?
Yeah, Lou was such a serious guy. I mean, first of all, he really believed that he had a chance to beat this illness and that he might live a long time, and he wanted to do something serious with the time he had left. He was a little bit angry with the Yankees that they didn't make him a more interesting offer to get involved in coaching or scouting, and they were offering him pretty much just sort of symbolic roles, handshake jobs where you stand around and greet the fans. And he wanted to do something more with his life. He was still that solid, hardworking, German immigrant's son, and he was offered a job by the mayor as a parole commissioner. He took it very seriously. He studied the law and asked the mayor to, really treat him as if he were, any new employee that he wanted to be. He only wanted to do this job if he was qualified for it, and he went to work every day until he couldn't walk up the stairs anymore.
Yeah, one thing that struck me about his life was that essentially it was divided into two parts. The part where the object of his affection was his mother, and then the second part when after he met Eleanor and was married. Eleanor drug him out of his shell. They went on world trips. He was introduced to fine dining. Instead of eating pickled eels that his mother fixed, he liked lobster. He was introduced to a brand new world, and it's sad that it only lasted such a short time, but it was a complete transformation. I mean, even at spring training, before he met Eleanor, his mother would often go to spring training with him. And that's probably the last thing his other ball player mates would want to see, is mom come down to keep an eye on Lou, while they were down there thinking spring training, oh, this is going to be fun. We can drink and we can see if there are any women down here that are interested and just have a jolly good time as if they're on spring break in college. But not for him. He had his mom along.
It was interesting in the Pride of the Yankees that leading up to its actual filming, Eleanor was involved in not really vetting the script, but she to certain things in the script. She didn't object to the portrayal of his mother. In fact, if you think that before the transformation of his mother's character in the movie, before she accepted his playing baseball, she was a monstrous character. You should see the original notes for the script. This woman was the tyrant of all tyrants. And that's mainly Eleanor's influence on Paul Gallico, who wrote the original treatment for the movie, and the others wrote the script. But I think there was a tempering of that along the way as it was being filmed. But it was interesting how at some point the mother character accepts baseball, and she becomes a huge fan of baseball. She becomes a very, very pleasant character. That wasn't the way it was, certainly in Eleanor's eyes, and they had a bad relationship up until and after Lou's death.
Yeah, you do a good job of describing that in the book, Rich, and it's really one of the great tragedies that Gehrig, in the last years of his life, had to put up with a feuding wife and mother-in-law. That for a long time, Gehrig was not allowed to have his mother come visit him at the house while he was in bed. When he could no longer leave the house to go visit his parents, Eleanor wouldn't let Ma Gehrig in the house. And in some ways, those early drafts of the scripts are her revenge, or her sticking the knife in one more time and twisting it in this mother-in-law who she despised.
And as I recall, there was a lawsuit between within the family over what Lou left behind.
Yeah,
it wasn't a pretty sight, and one of Lou's caretakers was Eleanor's mother, and she joined in the fray also. A couple of letters I've seen where it just portrayed a horrible relationship between Eleanor and Lou's mother. It was just, it was very sad, and you could only imagine, here's a guy who in his last months probably couldn't move at all, if we know anything about the progress of ALS, and either he couldn't see his mother, or his mother was feuding with his wife. It couldn't have been what he meant when he said he was the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Yeah,
well, okay. Richard, does that mean that you think there was maybe some Hollywood magic in the finished product of the movie?
I'd say about 65% of it is Hollywood magic. There are basic truths to it, but no, even in the wedding scene, Ma Gehrig wasn't there. So, by the time of the wedding in the movie, there's a détente between the women, but not in real life.
That brings me to this question. When was the last time all of you saw the Pride of the Yankees?
Well, having seen it about 75 times, I have to say I saw it probably the last time earlier this year when MLB Network had it. I watch it because Bob Costas interviewed me before and afterwards, so I have to watch it.
Do you still cry?
I cry when I see myself being interviewed. Yes. I do cry. You cry at the expected moment in the speech, but there's a scene shortly before that where Eleanor is watching Lou try to tie his tie. It's a bow tie, and he can't do it. He has no dexterity left, and she's watching him through, through not through the door, but through an opening in the door where the hinges are, and she's crying, and that always gets me as much as watching Cooper deliver the speech. It's really quite moving. It's not a baseball movie. It wasn't supposed to be a baseball movie. There's maybe 11 minutes of action in it. Samuel Goldwyn didn't like baseball, didn't want to make a baseball movie. He wanted a love story, and he got a love story. That's where the movie's most effective, as a love story.
For myself, I think it's probably 3 years ago that I watched it while I was doing research for my Lou Gehrig book. I did not cry. Although I have had total strangers write to me after my book has come out and say that they have cried. A couple men telling me the first time in their lives that they've cried when Lou died. So it is a powerful story, whether it's in the movie or whether it's in book form.
Yeah, I went out of my way not to watch the movie while I was writing my book because I didn't want Gary Cooper to get in my head. Mm-hmm. I've done that with every book I've written. I try not to let the movie version, like I didn't watch Will Smith as Muhammad Ali because I didn't want any of that personality to infect my to infest my view of who this guy was I was writing about. But then after I finished writing it and before I turned the book in, I watched the movie and I cried a little bit. And just at the moment that Rich described too, it's as you said, Rich, it's a love story and it's that's what makes it effective. I don't think we'd be talking about it today if it was a baseball movie.
No,
since we're up, go ahead, Rich.
I think Goldwyn's objections, I don't think he knew exactly how good it was going to be. You never really know before a movie's made how good it's going to be. But his objections, baseball is toxic to box office. You can't do that. And he kept chopping the amount of proposed baseball scenes in the movie because Gallico was a baseball fan. Herman Mankiewicz was a baseball fan. The director was a baseball fan. And I don't have proof of all their objections, but you can imagine they wanted more baseball in there, and they didn't get it. And some of the scenes where you're looking at, you think it's Cooper, it's not Cooper, it's Babe Herman. When you need somebody to really look like a ball player and catch as a left-handed first baseman. So it's it is corny. It's vintage. It's a vintage of 1942. That doesn't matter to me. You got to think of it as one of the few, one of the first movies based on a true story in sports. And I think it works very well for its time. If it were made today, it would be made with an athletic actor who could play Gehrig. Wouldn't have to be taught how to play baseball, as Cooper was. But it's 1942.
Actually, in 42, Chadwick Boseman was not a very good baseball player when they started filming. He got better as it went along, but he can still do it today.
Yeah. Well, since we're still on the movie, Richard, how do you think that Hollywood came through with convincing people that the right-handed Gary Cooper was actually left-handed Lou Gehrig? Did they play with the number on his uniform? Did they do other tricks with cameras?
Well, based on the final product, there's very little to accept the myth that was even perpetuated by Cooper that he was so bad at being a left-hander that they flipped the negative, and everything he did right-handed is left-handed. Tom Schieber, the senior curator of the Hall of Fame, did a frame-by-frame analysis, and he said, if you were going to accept that they flipped everything, they flipped Cooper, then you have to flip everything. As a right-hander, you have to run to third base. Everything has to be reversed. Everything, the numbers. And he went down, and he's an expert on, the placket. And he saw that there was no reversal in the normal way that jerseys are made and where the zipper is on the pants. What happened with Cooper is he had never played baseball as a kid. He grew up riding horses. He played a little football. He went to boarding school for a couple of years in England. So he knew nothing about baseball. And maybe that was good for him. He didn't have to unlearn bad habits. So when he gets the role, no baseball experience, had never held a bat in his life, as far as I can tell. He gets tutored by Lefty O'Doul, great former National League batting champion. And I think what he did is he made Cooper mediocre enough to pass muster for audiences in 1942. His swing is nothing like Gehrig's. He had to be in the brief sequence, the collage of shots during the minor leagues. There's a telltale sign that they did flip the negative for the throwing. You can't turn a righty into a lefty very easily. So there's a sequence where from one shot to another, the Band-Aid on this hand suddenly looks like it's on this hand. That's when they flip it. Other than that, he was mediocre at best. But there was very little baseball action in the movie to really. It didn't overwhelm the story to see that he wasn't very good at it.
I want to get back to some questions about Lou himself. Jonathan, you must have come to start the book with an appreciation for Gehrig. Did your appreciation grow over time?
You mean just as a ball player? My appreciation for him? I'll start with that. Yeah, as a ball player, my appreciation certainly grew. Again, as I said earlier, you take for granted the numbers. You take for granted even the streak, 2,130 consecutive games. But when you think about what that means in the day that Gehrig was playing, when they were playing, double headers all the time, even in his last season, there was 1 month where they must have played 10 double headers. I think it was August, the hottest month of the summer. They're not traveling in air-conditioned private jets. They're traveling by train. They're playing. They don't have the kind of sports medicine we have today. And I'd say that final season, actually, when you want to talk about appreciation, I still think that Gehrig's final full season, 1938, may be the greatest individual accomplishment in sports. I put it up there. I put Jackie Robinson for baseball in 47, playing under the pressure of that relentless racism, right up there with what Gehrig did. He played an entire season with symptoms of ALS that were getting worse by the day. He never missed a game. He led the team to the championship. Joe DiMaggio helped a little bit. He ends up hitting 295, 28 homers, 114 RBIs, and something like a 930 OPS. Those numbers would get you a $25 million contract today, and he did it with ALS getting worse every day of the week every day of the week. And to me, I still cannot comprehend how that's possible.
Can we talk about July 4th, 1939 for just a bit? I'm sorry.
That might be for me.
No, it's my daughter. I forgot to think. Anyway, is it true that he almost didn't give the speech that day?
Oh, absolutely. As I said, as we've all said, he's so shy, and he really didn't want any kind of a celebration at all. And when it came, he was in the dugout dreading having to walk out onto the field, and you can just see it in his body language, and you can see it on the film when when his manager, Joe McCarthy, kind of gives him a shove. Well, first the MC actually says, "Mr. Gehrig is too moved to speak today." And they start rolling up the microphones. They start, packing up the gear. And Joe McCarthy gives him a little bump and says, "Come on, Lou." And Lou goes up there and gives the greatest speech in sports history, one of the greatest speeches in American history. And it came that close to not happening.
And remember, this was a hot July 4th. It was between games of a doubleheader. He had to stand there during the 20 minutes or so before he was to give a speech, and he seemed uncertain on his feet. McCarthy told, I think, Dave Dahlgren, keep an eye on him. I'm afraid he might fall. So here he is in the heat. His body is deteriorated, probably even, noticeably since the Yankees since he came back from the Mayo Clinic. And yeah, Sid Mercer, the MC, said, I don't think you can do it. The fans started chanting for him. And no one knew what he was going to do in the first place. There was a celebration for him, but it didn't say Lou Gehrig will speak. So here he is. And again, in the research about the book about the movie, in the research for the movie Pride of the Yankees, I found that Eleanor told several stories about the speech itself, about whether they wrote it together, whether he wrote it. I think he might have gotten help from a sports writer friend, but he went there with nothing in hand. He didn't read from a speech. Here's a shy guy who didn't give speeches, and he goes out there and delivers a terrific speech. Nobody recorded it accurately, it seems. There were so many versions of it as written by various sports writers in their accounts. And, Eleanor kept huge scrapbooks of everything that Lou did. There's nothing in them that shows a complete copy of the speech. So he did it ad lib.
I had actually done some research on it, and there are indications that he was writing the speech at the apartment in Larchmont. He had written down notes before he went to the stadium, so he had some notes. So
I was especially interested in some of the little things that never made it into the story. First of all, before the first game started, he got together with a lot of his Yankee comrades from previous years and apologized to them because he hadn't bought a keg of beer for them. Then, as he's waiting in the dugout to be introduced, he's sitting with a newspaper man. It could have been Bob Considine. I'm not sure at this point. I don't remember exactly. But as he's being introduced, Lou gets up off of the bench and stumbles and falls back on the bench. And the newspaper reporter is not even sure he's going to be able to get onto the field. But once he's out there, another little tidbit that never made much news is while this introduction is going on and on, there was a gust of wind that blew a hat off of one of the celebrities off of one of the tables. And of all the people gathered around there, Lou was the only one who took a couple steps forward, picked up the hat, dusted it off, and put it back on the table. Here's a guy being venerated by 60,000 people, and he's still Lou Gehrig enough to do a nice bit for probably a stranger. So that is to me is a pretty big insight into his character, that he would do such a thing on such an occasion.
I think what I love most about the speech is that, and as Rich said, the reporters weren't really taking good notes. They weren't sure he was going to speak, and nobody recorded the entire speech or saved a recording of the entire speech. I'm still searching for. I found a couple more sentences of it on video recently, and adding to the puzzle pieces that we have. We have about 4 or 5 sentences on film. But the really important thing about the speech is that it transforms Gehrig's image in that instant. The reporters the next day write that they had blown it in their appreciation of Gehrig all these years. All these years they had treated him as dull, as bland, and they had failed to see his true character. And it's in that moment when he stands up there and makes this short speech that he is transformed from a dull, maybe dumb jock into being, a really sensitive, smart guy who had strength that they had never seen all those years.
Yeah, it should be pointed out that the most famous line was given as the second sentence of his speech rather than at the movie version where it's inserted at the end to make it more dramatic. So
Yeah,
people who haven't read the speech itself will be under the false impression that he ended it with a bang.
And also the accepted version of the speech is from Eleanor's memory. When she told Samuel Goldwyn, I assure you this is the speech that he made, and she basically said, I'd like you to put it in the movie as it is. But it probably was inaccurate to some degree. How could it be, unless she had such an incredible memory? It was not going to be the complete version. As Jonathan said, there is no complete recording of it. It's our holy grail to find the rest of it. But if you piece together what the reporters wrote, and some of them wrote ridiculous versions of it, but some of the credible versions, Eleanor wasn't too far off, but she couldn't have been completely on point.
Was the echo in the movie real in real life? Was there
a reverb at the stadium? I think so. Yeah. In the movie, they shot that on a soundstage, so they had to make it up. I don't know. I think there was reverb, wasn't there, Jonathan?
I believe there was. Yeah. If you've ever been down on the field when they're doing announcements like that in a stadium that size, there's a massive echo.
A question for Alan. How did you come upon the Lost Memoir? How did you find that?
Well, my background has been in military history. The 12 books that I've written up to Lou Gehrig, The Lost Memoir, were all military history. And I was doing research on a potential article about two gentlemen from veterans from World War I who ran afoul of the Prohibition era law enforcement. And while I was looking at some California newspapers, I stumbled across Lou's columns entitled Following the Babe. So did some research, found that no one had seemed to use it before, sent an inquiry to the Copyright Office, found that it was in public domain because it had never been registered. So I got in touch with my agent and got in touch with Simon & Schuster. And after I convinced both of them that it was real, then things got rolling, and it's been a big success ever since. It was just dumb luck.
It's interesting that it was called, there were like 2 or 3 dozen chapters of something called Following the Babe. Here he was always in the Babe's shadow. His columns are ghostwritten as they were in the shadow of Babe also. And it's 1927, though, he really was firmly in the shadow. He came out of it slowly over the years, and after Ruth was gone from the Yankees, I think he had far less of a shadow. Of course, now he had DiMaggio playing, but I find it interesting. When I was curious about the articles that were part of your book, I was almost shocked to see they're all called Following the Babe, Chapter 1, 2, 3, 28. It's fascinating to me.
Well,
and of course, Eleanor did not want Babe Ruth in the movie.
That's true.
Didn't want him at all in there because she thought if he stole her husband's thunder in real life, he was going to steal the thunder of Gary Cooper as her husband.
He does steal every scene that he's in. Babe is my favorite part.
But you notice that he wasn't allowed to be in a scene on his own. He's always with someone else. That may have been the only concession to Eleanor's feeling about that, because Goldwyn was not going to say, we're not going to have Babe Ruth in there.
Right.
He was smart enough to know that you may want to bring in a lot of women to see a love story, but you want to bring in baseball fans too. You didn't want to get rid of them. So he allowed Babe in there. He didn't allow all the other Yankee players who were thought were going to be in there. There aren't that many in there with a role of any sort. And there's probably less Babe than there was going to be.
Mhm.
But the Babe played Babe pretty well.
He did great.
Far better than Steinbrenner played himself in Seinfeld, and he didn't get the role as himself. So.
Right.
Well, as far as the Following the Babe title for the articles, I think that was more the fact that Babe was third up in the batting order, and Lou Gehrig would bat clean up after him.
Okay.
And as far you mentioned that the columns were ghostwritten. I believe that the original Following the Babe articles were written by Lou Gehrig. The articles on the World Series in 1927 were written by Lou with the assistance of Ford Frick. And one of the reasons I think so is because if you read through it, Following the Babe, there are over 100 sentences that start with the word "and." If you read through the articles about the World Series, I think there are either 2 or 3 sentences that start with the word "and." So it seems like a professional writer would not have written in the style of the Following the Babe articles, but he would have written in the World Series articles in a more professional manner, as he did. There will be people who argue one way or another. That's my opinion.
Interesting. I found some of the original typed documents for those columns in George Pollock's papers, and it didn't say who the author was, but they were, written on, with that pretty much, double spaced, it looked like, written like press releases that had that kind of a format, but it didn't have an author's name on it.
Well, another thing that led me to conclude that Lou wrote the articles was the fact that he started in August, and by September he was missing deadlines, and paid reporters and writers do not miss deadlines. I'm speaking to 2 right now, so is that true or not? It just seemed that it was Lou trying to keep up, because in September he was not only involved in the home run derby with Babe Ruth, but he was also worried about his mother, who was going to have a serious operation later that month. So he may have been distracted by all that, but it just seems like if he'd been in cahoots with a professional writer, they would have maintained every deadline.
Yeah. I can write on deadline, but I can't hit 54 homers a year. So.
Right.
That's why you do what you do.
What Alan and I were talking about this. What was the 1927 Clubhouse like? Was it just Ruth lording over everybody, or were there factions? What was the 27 Clubhouse like?
Well, in my opinion, there were kind of 3 factions on the Yankee team in 1927. First of all, there were people like Lou Gehrig and Earl Combs. Gehrig, like I mentioned, liked to be alone, take walks, go to movies, ride roller coasters. Earl Combs was probably the most conservative person on the team. He wouldn't so much as drink a Coca-Cola, and he spent most of the time in his hotel room reading the Bible. On the other end was the Babe Ruth extreme, where anything goes with women, booze, and food, or anything else they could dream up. And that was basically Ruth and Musil and Dugan and Koenig and Waite Hoyt. They were up for anything. One of their favorite things to do in the hotels was wait until somebody found a girlfriend to bring home. They'd enter the room, and the other guys would get in a huddle outside, boost somebody up so he could peek through the transom to see what was going on and give them a play-by-play of what was happening inside the room. So
sounds like Ball 4.
It's probably not the only time that's happened. But then there's a group of people in the middle who didn't really hang out with either group, but were amenable to being around everybody.
Awesome. Yeah. So I'm hopping back in. We have some audience questions that you four can't see. So I'll read them off. They're just in a different window technology. There's a question from from Steven that kind of builds off that. Like, what specifically did Gehrig think of Babe Ruth while they were playing? Do you want to build off what Alan just said? Is there anything more to add to it?
Yeah, there's a really complicated relationship there. And it goes back, Gehrig grew up idolizing Ruth, as every young ball player did. And then Ruth really took him under his shoulder. That 1927 barnstorming tour was, Gehrig was the little brother to Babe. And then when Gehrig marries Eleanor, it gets more complicated. And Fred Lieb suggested in an interview that was never published that the big problem between Eleanor and Ma Gehrig was that Eleanor had slept with the Babe early on before she met Lou, and that everyone knew it. And once Ma Gehrig discovered that, there was no way she was ever going to accept Eleanor. And then Eleanor tells the story herself in her memoir of on the honeymoon with Lou on the ship, the Empress of Japan, heading to Japan on a barnstorming tour. Lou found her in the Babe's room drunk. And that's really when you see an end to the friendship. That's when you notice that even after Babe hits a home run, Lou doesn't shake his hand anymore when he crosses the plate. So the relationship is really complicated in ways that are just human. They were real people, and they had backstories. And Eleanor was in fact someone who hung around those Yankee parties in those early years, and may have had some history with the Babe. So that's one of the really fascinating relationships. The Babe and Lou is.
Should we be surprised that the one of the first people to visit Eleanor after Lou died was Babe and his wife?
No, I wasn't surprised at all, because the Babe loved everybody. The Babe held no grudges. If Lou was mad, and you can just see it on the 4th of July when Lou gives the speech, and if Lou's not exactly thrilled to see the Babe doesn't care. He puts him in a big bear hug and says, here I am, boy, big guy. He's not going to hold any grudges. The Babe just I think expected everybody, loved everybody, and expected everybody to love him back.
And there's a
go ahead.
photo of Babe looking into Lou's coffin, and Jonathan is absolutely right. Babe loved everybody, and he was probably crestfallen that he didn't have a relationship with Lou for all those years, and he tried to make up for it with that big hug, and and then mourning him as a friend would.
And then,
go ahead. Lou and Babe were not against cutting some hijinks themselves. On the train back to New York after winning one of the World Series, the two of them ran through the 3 Pullman cars on the Yankee train and basically ripped the buttons off of every piece of clothing they could find. Whether it was a shirt, pants, a jacket, coat, didn't matter whether it was brand new, how much it cost. They were so happy and glad that they just stripped it. And somebody wrote that you couldn't hardly walk through any of the sleeping cars without stepping on buttons. There were so many.
Ruth just asked the question in the chat. Didn't the feud between the Babe and Gehrig have something to do with Babe Ruth wanting Gehrig to join him in demanding more money?
No, I don't think that was an issue. I think that they were both, Babe was always involved in difficult negotiations over contracts, and Lou pretty much all his life signed whatever they gave him, and that might have disturbed the Babe a little bit, but no. And when Eleanor came along, Lou did learn to negotiate a little bit and hold out for the money he deserved, but I don't think that was at the root of their relationship issues. I think Babe might have also been angry that the Yankees cast him off late in his career and that Lou became the captain. But again, I don't think Babe held grudges about stuff like that.
And then we have a question from Ken. When did Lou actually know he had a fatal disease? From what I've seen, it seems like he thought he was going to recover for quite a while. Is that true?
Again, it's complicated. He knew that he had ALS. He knew it was a fatal disease. He went to the Mayo Clinic where he dealt with one of the top neurologists in the country, and this neurologist was a guy who didn't bend the rules. He wasn't going to go soft and try to sugarcoat it. But like everybody who gets a fatal diagnosis, Lou thought that he might be the one to beat it. And there were new treatments available. There were experimental drugs, histamines, vitamin E that doctors were experimenting with, and they thought they might have a chance to beat this thing. And Gehrig had his hopes raised at times, but again, I think that's fairly normal for just about anybody with a fatal diagnosis.
Well, literally just hours before he died, Ed Barrow was one of his last visitors, and they had a brief talk, and Barrow kissed him on the forehead. And as Barrow's leaving the room, Lou is telling him, "I think I can still beat it." So up until the very last minutes, I think he had hope.
Yeah, I think he was also trying to make it easier for the people around,
everyone else, yeah,
by saying that not to worry.
We have a question from Ron about just research, about how every generation research gets easier, digital newspapers, people finding things. And I'll kind of tweak the question. What was your approach when researching? How much did you rely on newspapers from Gehrig's day or found documents? What was things that you took advantage of?
For my book, Samuel Goldwyn, the producer at Pride of the Yankees, had left his papers to the Motion Picture Museum and Library and Museum in Beverly Hills. I'd say about 2/3 of my book were attributable to information there. Scripts, memos, contracts. Then Eleanor Gehrig left a lot of her papers to the Baseball Hall of Fame, where I found a lot of good stuff there. The rest of it was newspaper research. The great website newspapers.com, which is digitized newspapers going back to the 19th century, was critical to my work.
Yeah, I mean, my book's the oldest of the three here. So some papers were digitized, but not that many. So I had to go through a lot of microfilm as well. But I also was really fortunate to find hundreds of pages of letters that Gehrig wrote as he was dying to his doctor, letters that Eleanor wrote to the doctor, letters that the doctor wrote to Eleanor. And those were letters that had never been published before, had never been seen by anybody except the family of the doctor and the autograph collector who bought them, 10 years prior. So that was a huge discovery, because that, as far as I could tell, were the only words in Gehrig's own hand that we had, except for a few letters here and there. This was, Gehrig's handwriting. Then he starts typing, and then, as he gets weaker, he can't even sign his name anymore, and he uses a stamp for his name. But he's providing in really stunning and heartbreaking detail exactly what's happening to his body over the last 2 years of his life, and that was probably the most important research discovery that I made.
Yeah, Jonathan points out the big problem with historical research. The best things to use are diaries, journals, and letters. Often those aren't available. So the next best thing to go to are the newspapers, because especially in the early part of the 1900s, there were so many interviews that the subjects you're quoting, like if it's Lou Gehrig or Babe Ruth or somebody from earlier like Christy Mathewson, there are so many quotes that you can use that, as far as you know, were taken down as they were said. So that is where I basically start my research, because I've been lucky enough to find everything that I've always wanted in newspapers, and been disappointed when I go to look for the journals, the letters, and the other things that are just so scarce or unavailable, or you're not able to find them, even if they still do exist.
And we'll wrap up with a question from me, actually, my fan question. What, if you're still paying attention to baseball now, I assume most of you or all of you are, and Steve, I'd love to hear your answer too. What modern player reminds you most of Lou Gehrig? If any can get as close to Lou's legacy as possible.
It's a really good question.
That's a stumper.
I don't think I have an answer for that.
Well, I'll mention, I'll go off the baseball field here and talk about a football player, Steve Gleason, who was not a superstar, but who has carried Lou's legacy forward in a really strong way by promoting awareness and raising huge amounts of money for ALS, and who even as he's lost the ability to speak, is still out there and fighting with everything he's got, and knowing that he's dealing with a fatal illness, just showing that same kind of courage that Gehrig showed. It's hard to compare modern athletes to the older athletes, though, because they're all businessmen now, and it's such a high money enterprise that I don't know how you could be as humble and as shy as Lou Gehrig was today. But there are athletes who still have that same kind of quiet courage.
And any comparison with Lou Gehrig to players now, you can't separate Gehrig from his illness. You really can't. And if not for the illness, he would have been a great player, and that's it. So how do we measure courage? How do we measure is it courage in the face of just your talent dissipated, or an illness? Is Magic Johnson a parallel example in the way he dealt with having HIV? He fortunately has not faced death yet. And maybe he won't until he's 90 years old. So it's very hard to make that comparison. But Steve Gleason is the obvious comparison to a modern day athlete who's gone through exactly what Lou did, but he may have a longer life dealing with it than 2 years.
And he's already, I think, survived longer than Lou did.
Yeah, sadly, I think the vast majority of people in the country know Lou Gehrig more for the disease than for his career. And I think the three of us in our book have helped to put it more into perspective as to what his life meant and what he meant to baseball and the country. So he's more than a disease. He was a wonderful human being.
Great.
Definitely. Well, I want to thank all four of you, Steve, Jonathan, Rich, and Alan, for coming on to talk about Lou Gehrig, talk about his legacy. Even me, as a huge baseball fan, learned a lot just from listening to this, not even diving into your books. This was just amazing. Everyone out there, please, you can purchase all three of their books at Tattered Cover. We have our pop-up. If you're in Denver, we have our pop-up with 1,000 baseball books. All three of these books are out there. And I want to just thank everyone again for supporting independent bookstores. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary, and that's really a testament to our fans, and not our fans, our customers and authors who have supported us. I just want to highlight two more events today. We have a Home and Away, which is going to be all about baseball road trips and the best stadiums. And then we have Turning 2 later today with David and Andrew Moranis talking about baseball and being a father and son who love baseball and who write about baseball. So thank you everyone who came. Thank you panelists. Do you want to shout out where we can find you on the internet, website, or Twitter, or whatever, however we can find you?
I'm on Twitter at Rich Sandomir. Yeah, I'm Jonathan Eig, and it's the same address for the website, jonathaneig.com. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you can find me at alandgaff.com. There are links there to Facebook and Twitter as well.
And stevewulf.com, called The Evening Sun. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, and have a safe and great evening, and hope to see you all soon now that the world's opening back up. Have a good one.
Nice to meet you, Alan. Good to see you.
Nice to meet you. It's been great.
Same here. Take care.
Thank you, guys.